My brother and sister, there comes a moment when life feels completely still. No answers, no movement, no clear direction. Just a quiet space where your questions echo back at you and nothing around you seems to respond. You sit with your thoughts and ask, Ya Allah, why is nothing changing? Why does it feel like I am waiting in the same place again and again? But what if this silence is not a sign of abandonment? What if it is actually a form of communication you have not yet learned to read? Because not every delay is rejection, not every closed path is a punishment, and not every quiet season is empty. Sometimes, when nothing is happening outside, there is a deeper movement taking place within you, quiet, unseen, but deeply intentional. The heart is being shaped without noise. The direction is being corrected without explanation, and the soul is being prepared for something it cannot yet recognize. And in these moments, there are hidden signs, subtle, quiet, almost invisible, that Allah has not stepped away from you, even for a second. The strength you didn't plan. For one of the hidden signs that Allah is still with you begins in a place you do not even notice at first, your own survival. Think back to the moments you thought you would not be able to continue. The nights when your chest felt heavy, when your thoughts were louder than your patience, when you genuinely believed that this time you might not recover the same way again. Yet here you are, still standing, still moving forward, still carrying a life that once felt too heavy to hold. You did not plan this strength. You did not sit down one day and decide, I will become someone who can endure this much. It was not trained into you like a skill, and it was not built through comfort or ease. In fact, it came in the opposite way. It appeared in moments you never asked for, in situations you never prepared for, and in emotions you never expected to face. And that is what makes it different from ordinary strength, because ordinary strength is visible, it is practiced, it is known, but this kind of strength, it surprises even you. You only notice it after you have already survived something you once believed would break you completely. There were times when everything around you felt like it was collapsing at once. Plans did not work, people changed, expectations fell apart. And in those moments, you were not thinking about growth or lessons. You were only trying to get through the next hour, the next day, the next moment without falling apart. Yet something inside you refused to collapse fully, not because the pain was light, but because there was a support you could not see, a quiet holding that prevented total breakdown, even when everything else felt unstable. You may have thought it was just getting used to it or becoming numb, but it was deeper than that, because numbness does not rebuild a person. But you are still here, still functioning, still trying, still hoping in small ways, even when you thought hope was gone. That is not accidental. And if you reflect honestly, you will notice something else. The version of you standing here today is not the same version that entered the hardest moments. Something has been added. Something has been strengthened in a way you cannot fully explain. You did not become stronger by choice alone. You were carried through situations that required a strength you did not yet have. This is why, in moments of silence and confusion, when nothing around you seems to be changing, this becomes one of the clearest signs you were given endurance beyond your own capacity. Not to show you how strong you are, but to remind you that you were never walking alone in the first place. The silence that feels different is a type of silence that confuses the heart at first. It is not the silence of peace you choose, and it is not the silence of comfort you enjoy. It is the silence that arrives in the middle of your confusion, when you are waiting for something to change, when you are asking for answers, and when nothing outside responds in the way you expect. You look at your situation and feel like nothing is moving, no clear improvement, no visible progress, no sudden opening of doors, and yet something inside you begins to behave differently. That is where this sign begins to appear, because in normal distress, the heart reacts immediately. It panics, it overthinks, it breaks down repeatedly. But in this kind of silence, something unusual happens. The intensity does not rise the same way it used to. The emotional storm does not fully take over like before. You are still aware of the problem, but the internal reaction feels slightly reduced, as if a layer has been placed between you and complete collapse. You may think this is just tiredness. You may assume you are simply becoming numb or disconnected. But there is a difference between emotional exhaustion and this strange inner steadiness. Exhaustion makes a person empty. But this silence, it keeps you functioning, even when you do not feel fully fine. And what is more interesting is that this calm does not come from your planning. You did not sit and decide to become stable. You did not train your heart to stop reacting. It appears in situations where logically you should be more disturbed, not less. Yet, something reduces the intensity from within. You still feel the weight of your situation, but it no longer destroys your entire system at once. You still think about your problems, but they do not consume every moment like they used to. Even your thoughts begin to slow down in a way you cannot control. This is why the silence is different. It is not absence of struggle. It is the presence of control over the struggle you did not personally install. And if you observe carefully, you will see that in this same silence, certain reactions you once had are no longer triggered so easily. Things that used to break your patience now pass with less damage. Situations that used to shake your heart now only touch it lightly and then fade. This is not emotional weakness. It is not detachment from life. It is something more subtle, something more intentional than your awareness. Because when Allah places calm in a place where chaos should have taken over, it is not random. It is protection in a form you are not used to recognizing. A quiet guarding of the heart while the situation outside is still unresolved. And this is why, even though nothing around you may have changed yet, something inside you already has. Repeated closed paths. There is a strange experience every person goes through at some point in life when the same direction keeps closing again and again. You try, you plan, you make an effort. You think maybe this time it will work. You approach it with hope, sometimes even with urgency, but the outcome remains the same. It does not open, it does not progress, it does not respond the way you expect. The heart interprets this as delay. You tell yourself maybe the timing is not right yet, so you try again and again. With slightly more effort, slightly more expectation, sometimes even with frustration, hidden behind patience. But the result does not change. And this is where something deeper begins to form, even if you do not notice it immediately. Because when a path closes once, it can feel like coincidence. When it closes twice, you think it is bad timing. But when it keeps closing in front of you, despite different attempts, different approaches, and different moments in life, it starts to become a message that is no longer random. Yet the human heart struggles to accept this because we naturally believe that persistence should eventually open every door. We are taught to keep trying, to keep pushing, to keep returning to what we want. But not every door responds to effort. Some doors are not meant to be opened by repetition. And still, the lesson does not arrive loudly. It arrives through experience, through repetition, through the quiet refusal of outcomes that do not align with your expectation. You begin to notice something subtle. Every time you are redirected, even if it is painful in the moment, it prevents you from entering a situation that would have demanded more than you were prepared to carry. At the time, you do not see it that way. It feels like blockage. It feels like a delay. It feels like something is being taken away from you without explanation. But later, when distance gives you clarity, you start recognizing a pattern. The very things that did not open often led to relief you did not understand at the time. The things you were strongly attached to but could not reach sometimes carried complication you were not ready to see. And this is where the meaning of repeated closed paths begins to shift. It is no longer just about what you did not get. It becomes about what you were prevented from entering before it could affect you in ways you could not predict. Because not every closed path is a rejection of your effort. Sometimes it is a redirection away from something that looks right on the surface, but is not aligned with your long-term peace. And the most difficult part is that this understanding rarely comes during the moment of closure. It only becomes clear after time has passed, when your emotions are no longer attached to the outcome, and you can finally see what was being avoided without your awareness. So these repeated closures are not just interruptions in your plan. They are silent corrections in a direction you cannot fully see yet. And when nothing is happening in your life, sometimes it is not because everything has stopped, but because you are being gently moved away from what was never meant to stay open for you, the protection. You only understand later. There are moments in a person's life that feel painful at the time, but only make sense much later. In the beginning, you only see the loss. You only feel disappointment. You only experience the ending. And in that state, it is very difficult to imagine that anything good could be hidden inside it. Something leaves your life. A situation ends suddenly. A connection breaks. A plan collapses without warning. And naturally, the heart reacts based on what it sees in the moment. It assumes that something important has been taken away, something valuable has been removed, something necessary has been denied. But time has a different way of revealing meaning. Because what feels like removal in the present can often be protection that you were not ready to recognize at the time. And this protection does not always come in a gentle form. Sometimes it comes through endings that feel uncomfortable. Sometimes it comes through disappointment that you cannot immediately explain. Sometimes it comes through situations that force you to step back, even when you want to move forward. You may remember how strongly you felt about certain things in your past. How convinced you were that a specific path was right for you. How certain you were that a particular outcome would bring you peace or happiness. You may have even made sincere effort, emotional investment, and repeated attempts to make it work. But then something happened that stopped it. It did not continue. It did not open further. It did not become what you expected. It feels like an interruption. It feels like something is standing between you and what you want. And naturally, the heart questions it. Why now? Why this way? Why me? But later, when distance creates clarity, you begin to notice something important. The very thing that did not continue often carries consequences that you were not aware of at the time. Situations you did not see clearly, patterns you could not recognize, emotional or practical weight you were not prepared to carry without force. Understanding begins to enter the heart. You realize that what was removed was not always a loss of something beneficial. Sometimes it was removal from something that would have gradually affected your peace in ways you could not see at the beginning. Not everything harmful appears harmful at first. Some things look appealing, feel right, and even seem necessary in the moment, but their long-term effect is something the heart is not always equipped to predict. And this is where protection becomes visible, but only after time has passed. Because protection does not always feel like comfort when it is happening. Sometimes it feels like confusion. Sometimes it feels like disappointment. Sometimes it feels like something is not going according to your plan at all. But later, when your emotions are no longer attached to that moment, you begin to see a different picture. You start realizing that certain closed paths saved you from deeper complexity. Certain endings saved you from emotional exhaustion you did not yet experience. Certain disappointments prevented you from entering situations that would have required more from you than you were prepared to give. And the most interesting part is that this understanding does not come from someone telling you. It comes from life itself. It comes from distance. It comes from seeing how things unfolded afterward and recognizing what you were spared from without knowing it. This is why this type of protection is called understood later, because at the moment, it does not look like protection at all. It looks like an interruption. It looks like a loss. It looks like something is going wrong. But when time removes the emotional weight, you begin to see that some of your strongest disappointments were quietly redirecting you away from something you were not meant to carry long term. The heart begins to soften, not because everything went your way, but because you start to understand that not everything that stopped you was against you. The return of light after darkness, after long periods of confusion, emotional heaviness, or unanswered questions, something very subtle begins to happen in a person's life. A return of light that does not arrive suddenly, but slowly, almost quietly, as if it is being restored piece by piece. You may not even recognize it as change, because when someone has been sitting in emotional darkness for a long time, they begin to normalize that state. They get used to unanswered thoughts. They get used to delayed outcomes. They get used to carrying weight without clarity. So when something soft begins to return, the heart does not immediately label it as healing. It starts in very small ways. A situation that once disturbed you deeply no longer affects you with the same intensity. A thought that used to pull you into overthinking passes more quickly. A memory that once felt heavy no longer holds the same emotional grip. These are not dramatic shifts that announce themselves loudly. They are quiet adjustments inside the heart that slowly change how you experience life. And you may find yourself wondering, why do I feel slightly different now, even though nothing outside has fully changed? That question itself is part of the sign, because this return of light is not always connected to external improvement. It is not always linked to immediate solutions or visible breakthroughs. Sometimes your environment remains the same for a while, but your internal response begins to soften. The pressure that once felt constant starts to loosen in ways you cannot fully explain. Even your thinking begins to shift. Where you once only saw closed doors, you now start noticing small openings. Where you once felt stuck, you now begin to consider possibilities that were not visible to you before. Not because the situation has completely changed, but because your perception is no longer trapped in the same emotional state. And this is where many people miss the meaning of this phase. They expect change only in outward events. They wait for everything around them to transform before they acknowledge progress. But sometimes the first sign of relief is not in the situation changing. It is in your heart, no longer breaking under the same weight the way it used to. You still remember what you are going through. You are still aware of your circumstances, but the relationship between you and your hardship begins to shift. It no longer occupies every corner of your thoughts. It no longer defines every moment of your day. It becomes something you are carrying instead of something that is consuming you. Without you forcing it, moments of ease begin to return. A conversation feels lighter. A thought feels less heavy. A moment of silence no longer feels uncomfortable. Instead, it begins to feel neutral and then slowly peaceful. This is not forgetting. This is not escaping reality. This is internal balance, being restored after a long period of emotional pressure. And if you reflect carefully, you will notice something even deeper. The return of light is not only about feeling better, it is also about becoming less reactive to what once controlled your emotions. You begin to pause more. You begin to respond differently. You begin to carry yourself with a quieter understanding, even if your external situation is still in process. This is why this stage is so important, because it shows that something inside you is no longer in the same state it was before. The heaviness has not fully disappeared, but it no longer dominates you the way it used to. And in moments like this, the heart begins to understand something without needing explanation. That relief does not always arrive as a sudden event. Sometimes it arrives as a gradual return of light after a long stretch of darkness, where you slowly realize that you are no longer the same person who entered it. The change you didn't notice in yourself. There is a kind of transformation that does not announce itself. It does not come with a clear moment where you can say, "This is when I changed." Instead, it happens quietly, across days, across experiences, across situations that you thought were just part of your normal struggle. And only later do you realize you are no longer the same person who entered those moments. You may still remember the way you used to react, how quickly certain things would disturb your peace, how deeply certain words would stay in your mind, how certain situations would pull you into overthinking for hours, sometimes days. At that time, it felt like this was just your nature, something fixed, something unchangeable. But now something is different. The same situations do not reach you in the same way anymore. The same triggers do not affect your heart with the same intensity. The same thoughts that once controlled your emotions now pass through more quietly without staying as long as they used to. And you don't even remember when this shift happened. That is what makes this sign so subtle. Because real change does not always feel like progress while it is happening. It often feels like repetition, like waiting, like nothing is moving. But in reality, beneath the surface, your internal response system is being reshaped. You begin to notice small gaps between reaction and response. A moment where you would have reacted instantly now feels delayed. A situation that would have pulled you into emotional chaos now only touches you briefly before passing. This is not because life has become easier, but because you are no longer meeting life with the same internal condition you once had. And what is interesting is that this change is not something you consciously trained yourself into. You did not sit and decide to become calmer. You did not plan to become less reactive. It happened through exposure, through patience, through experiences that slowly reshaped your emotional boundaries. Even your priorities begin to shift without effort. Things you once considered extremely important start to lose their intensity. People, outcomes, expectations, they no longer carry the same weight they once did. Not because you stopped caring, but because your heart is learning what actually deserves its energy. And this is where the deeper meaning of this change becomes visible. It is not just about becoming stronger in the usual sense. It is about becoming less controlled by what is temporary, less shaken by what is uncertain, less attached to what was never meant to define your stability. You may even feel slightly disconnected from your old self, the version of you that used to overthink, react quickly, and carry emotional pressure in silence. That version still exists in memory, but it no longer dominates your present responses. And this shift often goes unnoticed because it does not come with celebration. There is no clear event marking it, no moment of announcement. It is only visible when you compare how you used to feel with how you now respond. A realization begins to form. You did not just go through situations, you were being shaped by them. Not into someone different in identity, but into someone more grounded in response. This is why this change is one of the hidden signs that Allah is still with a person. Because when a heart is being guided quietly away from its old reactions, it is not random. It is refinement happening without noise, without announcement, and without needing your full awareness in the moment. And only later do you understand. The silence did not stop your growth. It was part of it. The connection that never disappears, even in the moments when a person feels far confused or emotionally disconnected. There is something that does not break a connection that remains present, even if it is not always felt clearly in the heart. There are times when you sit alone with your thoughts and feel like you are distant from everything. Your situation feels unclear, your answers feel delayed, and your heart feels quieter than usual. And in that silence, a thought may pass through your mind, have I been left alone in this? But this feeling itself is part of human experience, not the truth of the connection. Because what is often misunderstood is that connection is not always measured by feeling. There are moments when a person feels nothing emotionally, yet something is still intact beneath that silence. Just because the heart does not sense it strongly in that moment does not mean it is gone. Think about the times in your life when you were going through confusion, yet somehow you still found yourself moving forward, still waking up, still being guided away from certain harm, still finding small moments of relief even when you did not expect them. At the time, you may not have connected these moments together, but when you look back, a pattern begins to appear. A pattern of being held even when you felt unsteady. A pattern of being redirected even when you did not understand why. A pattern of being protected even when you thought nothing was happening. And this is where the deeper understanding begins. Because a connection that depends only on how you feel in the moment would be fragile. But what is being described here is not something fragile. It is not interrupted just because emotions fluctuate. It is not removed just because clarity is delayed. There are seasons where a person's inner world feels quiet, almost distant. Yet, during those very seasons, decisions are still being guided, situations are still being arranged, and outcomes are still unfolding in ways that the person only understands much later. You may not always feel it, you may not always recognize it. There may be days when you question everything, but even those questions do not disconnect you from what is already written for your path. And sometimes the absence of feeling is itself part of the process, because when emotions are loud, perception becomes clouded. But in moments of silence, even if it feels uncomfortable, something deeper is being arranged without distraction. This is why distance is not always separation, and silence is not always absent. There are forms of connection that do not depend on constant emotional awareness. They continue even when the heart is unsure, even when understanding is incomplete, even when clarity has not yet arrived. And later in life, when you reflect on your journey, you begin to see something very different from what you felt in the moment. You realize that even in your confusion, things were not falling apart randomly. Certain paths were being closed with precision. Certain outcomes were being delayed with purpose. Certain situations were unfolding in ways that kept you away from harm you could not fully see at the time. And in that realization, the heart softens because you understand that the connection was never lost. It was only hidden from your immediate perception so that your experience could unfold in a way that you would only understand at the right time. And when that understanding arrives, it does not feel like discovering something new. It feels like remembering something that was always there, even when you could not sense it. When life feels still and your prayers feel like they are echoing into silence, do not assume nothing is happening, because not every response is loud. Not every answer arrives in the way you expect. Sometimes Allah is closer in your silence than in your comfort. Sometimes the delay you are living through is not rejection. It is a redirect you are not ready to see yet. And if you paid attention today, you will realize the signs were never missing. They were just quiet. So don't lose hope in what you cannot see yet. Because what is being written for you is moving, even when your life feels still.